Welcome back. The final couple of weeks of Parliament before this election year ends sees the government trying to wrest back control of the narrative after their debacle on education funding. Tony Abbott wants to refocus attention on repealing Labor's carbon tax and sorting out the debt ceiling. But with even the Liberal New South Wales government openly attacking the Abbott government last week, Tony Abbott needed to stem the political damage. Today, announcing he will honour the deal New South Wales, Victoria and other states had already signed with the federal government on education funding. The past few weeks have been unsteady for Tony Abbott's government, from the deterioration of relations with Indonesia over spying allegations to the education row and the Treasurer blocking the GrainCorp takeover in a move that shocked the market and perhaps said Australia was not really open for business. So can the government regain the agenda to win support in the Senate to pass its legislation to repeal the carbon price? Well, joining me to discuss all these issues is Labor MP Michael Danby and Steve Ciobo, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, from our Parliament House studio. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Steve Ciobo, if I could ask you first, was this education deal a massive backflip forced on the government to really stop the political damage?
No, it certainly wasn't, Helen, and I think there's a few people getting a little bit excited about what's happened on the Labor side, but the reality is, let's look at what's transpired. We indicated prior to the election that we would match Labor dollar for dollar when it came to education funding. We discovered that one of the final acts of the former Education Minister, the former Labor Education Minister, none other than now the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, was to rip $1.2 billion out of education funding. Now, for me as a Queenslander, that would have meant that my local schools and Queensland schools, Western Australian schools, Northern Territory schools would have been $1.2 billion worse off. So what we did is that we said we would provide funding back to provide certainty for next year ahead of the meeting of education ministers, and then since that point we've now reached an agreement with all states. So we have a truly national agreement that includes the states of Queensland, WA and of course the Northern Territory, so that now we're putting $2.8 billion of additional money on the table, more than Labor promised and more than any of the jurisdictions we're going to get, and that's been done under the coalition.
All right, but Steve Ciobo, you'd have to admit, last week Christopher Pyne said there would only be a funding deal with some states who had signed legal agreements for just 1 year. Now he's saying he will honour a 4-year deal. Last week Chris Pyne said the whole thing was a shambles, he'd have to go back to square one.
Sure.
Now he's honouring it.
Well, again, Helen, I mean, you've got to look at what's happened. We came to government. We were unaware that Labor had ripped $1.2 billion of funding out.
But would it be actually fair to say that what's really happened has been the political damage over that last week?
No, what's happened is that there was a $1.2 billion hole. We tried to provide certainty. The Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, tried to provide certainty by saying, OK, here's $230 million that we'll put on the table right here and now so we can look at the national agreement. And he did that before the Education Ministers meeting. And then the Education Ministers met. We've been able, over the last 72 hours or thereabouts, to strike a truly national agreement, which Labor never had. And most importantly, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. $2.8 billion of funding on the table, which is $1.2 billion more than they would have gotten under Labor. We're delivering that for all of Australia under a truly national agreement. So as far as I'm concerned, some of the horse trading, and look, people know horse trading takes place, some of the horse trading that's been going on, some of the games that have been played, that's the political stuff, that's gone. Focus on $2.8 billion of money.
Before the election, Steve Ciobo, Tony Abbott said no school will be worse off. Then last week he tried to nuance that, I guess. He said he really meant the quantum of funding wouldn't change. And then yesterday he talked about not delivering on a promise that people wanted him to make. Can you understand how many in the community would think, you know, I'm confused, there's something dodgy going on?
Sure, of course. Well, look, I don't think this is any different, Helen, to what often, unfortunately, happens around political debates in this country. But I think that, and this is the key point that I try to stress, there's a lot of horse trading. Different things are said by different jurisdictions. Labor's out there saying one thing, the coalition's saying another. But when you get down to the brass tacks, this is what we're dealing with. $2.8 billion under the coalition, a truly national agreement, and I contrast it with Labor's final position, the former Labor Education Minister Bill Shorten, who ripped $1.2 billion of funding out. So any way you cut it, Under the Coalition, $2.8 billion of funding. Under Labor, they would have been $1.2 billion worse off.
All right, Michael Danby, Tony Abbott has now injected $1.2 billion extra. That's a good thing.
Look, if the about what the state governments will invest in those. I'm getting a bit of feedback on this, unfortunately.
Yes, Michael, I'm sorry. We did just miss the beginning of your answer. If you can, hopefully you're not getting the feedback. The $1.2 billion extra, that is a good thing the government's doing now.
It is, except for the fact that there are no arrangements with... No, the feedback's happening again, but I'll keep going. The Northern Territory, Queensland and West Australia haven't put any final agreements on what they will put in to education too. So of course the states would have, and the children in those places would have been much better off if they would have signed the Labor agreements prior to the election. I think the general tenor of your questions was very perceptive though. The great cartoonist for the Murdoch tabloids, Mark Knight, has portrayed Christopher Pyne, the Education Minister, as a petulant private school prat over the last week, and I think that is well, I'm sorry, it's what the cartoonist has got the insight into the Australian people's mentality about that, Steve, and I think that political pressure is what has caused the back down by the government in this area. I think the outrage of Conservative premiers about the changed position of the coalition, of the new government, but we still haven't seen the bottom line of all of this because we don't know what the Northern Territory, Queensland and West Australia have agreed to put in themselves. You see, under Labor's arrangements, there would have been a forced public knowledge of what they were going to contribute, so that children in individual schools, particularly those schools that don't have the great opportunities that some of the private schools have, are still might be worse off, and because we don't know the details.
All right, Steve Ciobo, will the new states that have signed up now, Queensland, WA, Northern Territory, will they get needs-based funding? Because Senator Erica Betts did say in the Senate today that some schools might be worse off.
Look, the actual model that will be applied will be I think it's called the Student Resources model, the Student Resources Index or something like that. At the end of the day, though, Helen, there is one inescapable reality. Labor, Michael, anybody from the Greens, they can say whatever they want to say. But the inescapable fact of the matter is this. There would be schools across Western Australia, Queensland and the Northern Territory that would be $1.2 billion worse off. Not some schools, every school in those states. Under the Coalition, every single school is getting all of the funding, $2.8 billion, plus the $1.2 billion, I should say the $1.2 billion that Labor ripped out of the education system. So, frankly, you know, I'm happy to have a little bit of white noise over the past week. People can read the tea leaves on that and say it means this, it means that. But the take-home message that I know that the parents around Australia get is this. $2.8 billion under us, under Labor, $1.2 billion ripped out.
Steve Ciobo, on another issue, there's talk now of a deal with the Greens on the debt ceiling. What is the government's thinking about this? He did want to raise it. Is he now wanting to scrap it? Is this an admission that there will be no return to surplus anytime soon?
No. What this is, Helen, is unfortunately the predicament that we find ourselves in because we've got a Labor Party that is playing just stupid political games around Australia's debt ceiling. And as a direct consequence of the games that Labor's playing, we as a government are desperately trying to provide stability, to provide certainty, to provide a clarity of direction when it comes to Australian financial markets. Now, I hear Labor members say repeatedly, oh, well, they just need to give us the mid-year economic fiscal outlook and then we'll know that, you know, it's all as we expect it to be and we'll allow the debt ceiling to go over $400 billion. But you know, Helen, what Labor never concedes, And what everybody knows, who's even had the most cursory look at the budget papers, is that under Labor, on their own figures, spending will hit $370 billion, I should say debt will hit $370 billion, and the Treasurer, the former Labor Treasurer himself, acknowledged that you need at least a $60 billion buffer. So on Labor's own numbers, not coalition numbers, Labor numbers, it's $430 billion. So why is Labor being so intransient on this and saying, no, $400 billion is the limit, that's all there is to it?
Why don't you keep trying to argue with them to get them to increase the debt limit? Why is the Treasurer now wanting to do a deal to scrap it completely?
Because we're starting to run out of time, Helen. That's the reason why. We're at serious risk of now breaching Australia's current debt limit, because never forget, Helen, the current debt ceiling at the moment is $300 billion. And we're literally days, maybe a week or two away from breaching that $300 billion limit. Now, we need to have a solution to this. Labor's only solution that they've put on the table is to kick the can down the road. And the Shadow Treasurer said, oh, well, you know, we'll raise it to $400 billion and that will see you through December. Well, that's not good enough. That's not how the coalition's going to govern. So I'm happy to take every opportunity to say to Labor, stop playing games with this. You left a mountain of debt. Do the responsible thing. Let's deal with it once. Let's deal with it for all time, and then it's dealt with, and we can make good decisions for the governance of this nation.
Helen, they said before the election that debt wasn't a problem and raising debt wasn't the way to handle it. It's interesting that they're so flexible that they're...
Debt wasn't a problem.
Steve, it's interesting that you're prepared to make an arrangement with the Greens, as you did to... during the last government, to sink the people transfer agreement with Malaysia. So the government's got a record of dealing with the Greens. Australia's and the opposition is willing to be responsible and raise the debt limit to $400 million. The Australian people want an account, just as they did under us, of why this needs to be done. Of course, we'll be responsible.
So you don't want to scrap it,
just
Michael
provide
Danby?
us with the... No, we don't want it scrapped until we know what the economic situation is. The government should be as honest as the previous government was when at each time when they sought an increase in the debt limit, they came to the Australian Parliament and explained why it was necessary.
All right, I'd like to move on to another issue.
Sure.
Steve Ciobo, the Grain Corp takeover was stopped by the Treasurer late last week. And even though the market had not anticipated that it wasn't against the national interest, the Treasurer widened the national interest test, according to his statement, to include the impact on the broader support for foreign investment. Is this a strange widening of the test, Steve Ciobo?
Not at all. I certainly don't agree with your assessment that the market, whatever that is, didn't.
Well, most of the market analysts did not expect it to be stopped, according by reports that Bloomberg had put out on Friday.
There were a number of commentators who foresaw that there would be difficulty in approving this. But I guess the key point here again, Helen, is that when you look at the number of proposals that have been put forward, when you look at the consideration of foreign investment by the Foreign Investment Review Board, and I think the Treasurer himself outlined this, there's been 131 applications that have come through. We've allowed 130 of them to go through. So only one we haven't, and 130 have gone through. So I think, seriously, is anybody saying that we're not a government that's open for business, that we're not focused on advantaging Australia?
No, but this one was stopped partly because it didn't pass the popularity test, I guess, with the community.
No, that's not the case at all. This particular proposal was knocked back because it effectively would have seen the handing over of a monopoly position to ADM. The government had concerns about that. We want to make sure that we always take decisions that are in Australia's long-term national interest. We make no apology for that. We are appointed defenders of the national interest. That's what the Treasurer did. And as I said, when you look at the facts, 130 yeses, 1 no, that's not a bad track record.
So did he widen the test?
No, not at all. The test of what is in Australia's national interest is a test that's determined by the Treasurer of the day in consultation with the Foreign Investment Review Board. So any suggestion that there's sort of some extraneous factor I don't think is supported by the facts.
Helen, a lot of people inside business thought, and the commentariat thought that this would go through because they thought Joe Hockey's a genuine free market guy, Treasurer of Australia. Similarly, people like Steve Ciobo, they're greatly embarrassed because this hasn't been been done in the national interest. This has been done in the National Party's interests. And they have a big influence on this coalition government. You can see it in this decision. Probably wasn't the right decision for the country. The Labor Party doesn't have all of the information that the government necessarily had, but we had a very good record on foreign investment. And we need foreign investment. We're a capital poor country, and this was a bad decision and sends a bad message out there to foreign investors.
Michael Danby and Steve Ciobo, one last issue I'd like to get your views on. Are you happy, Michael Danby, start with you, with the apparent change of heart by the Foreign Minister Julie Bishop to further support Israel and upset the Palestinians by instructing the government representatives at the UN to withdraw Australia's support for an order to stop the Israeli settlement activities in all of the occupied territories?
I think that the main thing we should be focused on, whatever party is in power, is that there are peace negotiations taking place between the Palestinians and Israelis at the moment. And I think, frankly, decisions at the United Nations are very secondary to this one way or the other. Let the parties who are involved proceed with their negotiations, and taking positions at the United Nations one way or the other on these controversial issues doesn't really assist development of peace between the two partners.
Steve Ciobo, Australia was one of only 8 other countries, as we understand it, to abstain from this, while 158 countries supported the UN in calling for an end to Israeli settlements, which have been very controversial, yet there was no discussion about it here.
Well, if you look at Australia's track record with respect to the United Nations, Helen, the reality is that Australia has abstained consistently for some period of time because there's a lot of nuanced positions when it comes to these international fora. Now, that changed a couple of years ago under Kevin Rudd as part of the then bid by the Labor Party to try to win our position on the Security Council. And I think, and I don't know this for fact, so I'm happy to say that this is my speculation, but I think Labor took the judgment that they'd changed the position that Australia had voted for many, many years, purely and simply because they thought it would be a more popular position and help to strengthen their bid for the Security Council. What we're effectively seeing is a reversion to where we've been previously.
All right. Unfortunately, gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our discussion. Michael Danby and Steve Ciobo, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Helen.
And next, meet the New South Wales